People misunderstand intimacy after 60 because they stop talking about it. They create a collective silence that causes profound harm to millions. These millions believe their emotional and physical needs should somehow evaporate with age, when the truth is that intimacy doesn't end with age. It evolves into something softer but deeper, less about performance and more about presence. I spent 40 years in a marriage where I was never truly seen or known, experiencing surface-level connection when I was hungry for something deeper. This is until I discovered at 64 with Sterling that real intimacy means being genuinely seen by another person. It's being able to express your authentic thoughts and feelings without fear of judgment, which is actually easier in your 60s and 70s, which is why I refuse to be ashamed of needing connection, touch, and affection at 86 years old.
I never believed that community gardens could be places of profound revelation until the afternoon of June 17, 2025. That was the day I met a woman who would fundamentally alter everything I thought I knew about aging, intimacy, and the human need for connection that persists across every stage of life. What she told me in those quiet hours among the tomato plants and rose bushes would challenge me, enlighten me, and ultimately lead me here, to you, sharing a truth so quietly revolutionary that most people never hear it because we've collectively agreed not to talk about it. My name is Branson. It is always my pleasure to bring to you tales from my personal encounters with unique individuals who have walked this life. As always, my name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is what I witnessed, what I learned, and what I'm about to share with you. Because the old woman was right about one thing. People misunderstand intimacy after 60 because they stop talking about it. And that silence, that collective agreement to pretend that emotional and physical needs somehow evaporate with age, causes profound harm to millions of people who find themselves entering their later years believing they're no longer entitled to connection, tenderness, or love. This is that story. It was one of those perfect spring afternoons when the world seems determined to remind you that beauty exists in ordinary moments. The temperature was warm without being oppressive, the sky that particular shade of blue that only appears in late spring, and the light had that golden quality that photographers spend careers trying to capture. I'd come to Riverside Community Gardens seeking a quiet place to work on an article I'd been avoiding for weeks, thinking the fresh air and gentle activity of gardeners around me might inspire productivity. I'm a freelance writer, which is a polite way of saying I cobble together enough assignments to pay rent while pretending I'm working on the novel I've been almost finished with for 3 years. But my real work, the work that actually feeds something essential in me, is collecting human stories. I watch people in grocery stores and coffee shops, in parks and waiting rooms, in all those ordinary spaces where people let their guards down and become genuinely themselves. I've learned more about the human condition from these observations than from any book or formal education. The community garden was moderately populated that afternoon, a handful of dedicated gardeners tending their plots, a young couple arguing quietly about whether to plant tomatoes or peppers, an older gentleman carefully staking his beans. And then there was her. She sat on a wooden bench near the rose section, a hardcover book open in her lap, reading with the kind of complete absorption that's become rare in our age of constant digital distraction. She appeared to be in her mid-80s, though she carried her age with a vitality that made precise estimation difficult. Her white hair was cut in a short, stylish bob that framed a face marked by age but not diminished by it. She wore a coral linen blouse, cream-colored slacks, and comfortable walking shoes, the kind of carefully chosen outfit that suggested someone who still cared about her appearance without being enslaved to it. But what truly caught my attention was her posture. She sat with her back straight, shoulders relaxed, chin level, the bearing of someone comfortable in her own skin, confident in her right to occupy space in the world. It was the posture of someone who had nothing left to prove and no one left to impress, yet still maintained dignity and presence. I'd claimed a bench about 20 feet away, laptop balanced on my knees, ostensibly working on my article but actually watching the various gardeners and their small dramas. My attention kept returning to the elderly woman, though, drawn by that quality of peaceful self-possession she radiated. After perhaps 30 minutes, she closed her book with a satisfied sigh and looked up, as if noticing the garden and other people for the first time. Her eyes swept across the space and landed on me. Instead of looking away politely, as most people would, she held my gaze for a moment and smiled, Not the polite social smile we give strangers, but something warmer and more genuine, as if we were already friends and she was simply acknowledging my presence. I found myself smiling back and before I could think better of it, calling out, "Good book?" "Excellent book," she replied, her voice clear and strong despite her age. She held it up so I could see the cover, something about the history of botanical gardens. I'm learning about how the Victorians organized their plant collections. Fascinating how much symbolism they attached to flowers. Every bouquet was a coded message. That's the kind of knowledge that feels like it should still be useful, I said, standing and walking closer so we wouldn't have to shout across the garden. Though I suppose text messages are less ambiguous than trying to communicate through flower arrangements. She laughed, a sound that was both youthful and knowing. Less ambiguous, perhaps, but also less thoughtful. There was something beautiful about taking the time to carefully select flowers that conveyed exactly what you wanted to say. It required attention, knowledge, care. Now we send emojis and think we're communicating. May I? I gestured to the empty space on her bench. Please, she said warmly. I've been reading for an hour. My eyes could use a break, and conversation is always welcome. I sat down, and we fell into the easy small talk of strangers finding common ground. Comments about the beautiful weather, observations about the dedicated gardeners around us, discussion of what we might plant if we had our own plots. But I had the sense that both of us were circling something more substantial, waiting for the conversation to find its natural depth. I'm Estelle, by the way, she said after a few minutes. Estelle Pritchard. I've been coming to this garden for 6 years now, ever since my niece decided I could observe gardening but not actively participate. It's peaceful here. I'm David, I replied. I'm relatively new to the area. This is only my second visit to the garden. I came looking for a quiet place to work, but I've been too distracted by people watching to get much done. Estelle's eyes sparkled with understanding. You're a writer, Sting. The laptop gave it away, but more than that, you have the look of someone who watches people to understand them, not just to pass time. What do you write about? Officially? Whatever assignments I can get, articles about local businesses, features for magazines, the occasional ghost-written piece. Unofficially? I collect people's stories. I'm fascinated by what people reveal about themselves in ordinary moments. And what have you observed about me in the hour you've been watching? Estelle asked, amusement clear in her voice but no offense taken. I felt my face flush with embarrassment at being caught so directly. I didn't mean to stare. Estelle waved away my discomfort. Oh, I know you were watching. I'm 86 years old, dear. I notice more than people think. And I don't mind. I'm curious what conclusions you drew. I considered her question seriously, deciding that if she was genuinely curious, I should be honest. I observed that you're someone who's comfortable with solitude but not isolated by it. You read with complete absorption, which suggests you're still intellectually engaged with the world. Your posture and the care you take with your appearance suggest self-respect and confidence. And the way you're talking to me now, openly, directly, without the guardedness most people maintain with strangers, suggests you've reached a stage of life where you've stopped worrying about what people think. Estelle smiled with evident pleasure. That's a remarkably accurate assessment from an hour of observation. You have a gift for reading people. And you're absolutely right, I did stop worrying about what people think. It happened somewhere around my 70th birthday. One of the genuine gifts of aging, though nobody tells you about it when you're young. She shifted slightly on the bench, getting more comfortable, and I recognized the body language of someone settling in for a longer conversation. Since you're a collector of stories and a reader of people, let me ask you something. What do you think happens to people's need for intimacy, for genuine connection, physical affection, emotional closeness, as they age? The question caught me off guard, both because of its directness and because of the topic. I suppose I've never really thought about it carefully. I guess I assumed those needs diminished as people got older. Exactly, Estelle said, and there was satisfaction in her voice as if I'd confirmed something she'd suspected. That's what most people assume. That somewhere around 60 or 70, human beings suddenly stop needing touch, companionship, physical intimacy, emotional connection. That we become these sanitized, desexualized beings who are content with occasional visits from grandchildren and weekly phone calls. She leaned forward slightly, her expression becoming more intense. And that assumption, that collective fiction we all agree to believe, it causes tremendous suffering to millions of people who find themselves entering their later years with all the same needs they've always had, but with the added burden of shame for having them. Because if everyone believes those needs should disappear, and yours haven't, then something must be wrong with you. You must be inappropriate, or undignified, or pathetic. I found myself leaning in as well, completely absorbed. This was already unlike any conversation I'd ever had with someone of Estelle's generation. People misunderstand intimacy after 60 because they stop talking about it, Estelle continued. Young people don't want to think about their parents or grandparents as sexual or romantic beings. Adult children become uncomfortable when widowed parents start dating. Society treats elderly sexuality as either invisible or comedic. And so people stop talking about these needs, stop acknowledging them, pretend they don't exist. But silence doesn't erase need. It just makes it shameful. She settled back against the bench, her expression softening. I learned this the hard way over many years and through experiences I never expected to have. And I've decided that the silence needs to be broken, even if it makes people uncomfortable. Especially if it makes people uncomfortable. Because there are too many people suffering in quiet loneliness, convinced they're not entitled to connection anymore simply because they've passed some arbitrary age threshold. Estelle looked at me directly. You're a collector of stories. Would you like to hear mine? It's about intimacy and aging and learning, far too late in life, that connection matters more than propriety. It's about widowhood and rediscovery and the surprising ways that love can find you when you're not looking for it. It might make a good story for your collection. I had nowhere else to be and no article more important than whatever this remarkable woman was about to share. I'd be honored to hear it. Estelle smiled, then took a slow breath, gathering her thoughts before beginning. To understand anything about my later life, you need to understand who I was for the first 60 years. Because the woman I became after 60 was built on the foundation, and in many ways, in reaction to the woman I was before. I was born in 1938, Estelle began, her voice taking on the quality of someone reaching back across decades to retrieve memories carefully stored. In a small town in western Pennsylvania that doesn't really exist anymore, absorbed into a larger municipality, the town boundaries erased on maps even if they persist in old-timers' memories. I was the youngest of 4 children, the only girl, raised in a household where expectations were crystal clear and deviation from them was not an option. She shifted on the bench, getting comfortable for what would clearly be a long story. My mother and father were good people. I want to establish that first, because what I'm about to describe wasn't cruelty or abuse. It was simply the way things were done in that era, in that place, in that social class. My father worked at the steel mill. My mother maintained the household with military precision. We attended church every Sunday. We didn't discuss feelings or needs or wants. We discussed duties and responsibilities and proper behavior. Estelle's expression grew thoughtful, as if she were examining that world from her current vantage point of 86 years. I was raised to be a wife and mother. Not in addition to other things. That was the career, the calling, the complete definition of female purpose. I took home economics classes in high school. I learned to cook, to sew, to manage a household budget, to present myself as pleasant and agreeable. I was taught that a woman's success was measured entirely by her ability to attract and keep a suitable husband and raise well-behaved children. I met Harlan Pritchard when I was 19 years old, Estelle continued. He was 24, working as an insurance adjuster, already established in a stable career. He was handsome in a conventional way, responsible, respectful. He attended the same church as my family. He was, by every measure my parents valued, an excellent match. When he asked my father's permission to court me, permission was enthusiastically granted. Estelle paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. I want to be clear about something. I did love Harlan. Not with the passionate, all-consuming love that movies and novels promised, but with genuine affection, respect, and partnership. He was kind to me. He never raised his voice, never raised his hand, never drank to excess or gambled away our money or any of the dramatic ways that men could make women's lives miserable. By the standards of 1958, he was a genuinely good husband. We married in June of 1958, 3 months after my 20th birthday, she said. Small wedding in our church, reception in the fellowship hall, honeymoon weekend at a cabin owned by Harlan's uncle. We moved into a small house that Harlan had saved for, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a tiny kitchen where I learned to make the meals Harlan preferred. And I threw myself into being the wife I'd been raised to be. Estelle's voice took on a quality that was both nostalgic and critical, as if she were examining her younger self with compassionate but clear-eyed assessment. I was a good wife by those standards. The house was always clean. Meals were always ready when Harlan came home. His clothes were washed and ironed. I was pleasant and agreeable. I didn't complain or make demands. When friends and neighbors asked how I was doing, I said I was doing wonderfully, because that's what you said. You didn't discuss problems or dissatisfactions. You maintained the appearance of contentment, and eventually, the appearance became the reality you inhabited. We had 3 children, Estelle continued. Judith was born in 1960, Robert in 1962, and Patricia in 1965. 3 children in 5 years, which was exhausting but expected. My mother had 4 children in 6 years, so I was actually pacing slightly slower than her generation. And I loved my children fiercely. That part of motherhood came naturally and joyfully. They were funny and frustrating and endlessly demanding, and I poured all my energy into raising them well. She paused, her expression becoming more complicated. But here's what nobody told me. You can love your husband, love your children, do everything right according to the script you were given, and still feel profoundly lonely. Still feel like there's something missing, some essential need going unmet, some part of yourself that's been carefully stored away because there's no space for it in the life you're living. Estelle looked at me directly. Do you understand what I mean by intimacy, David? Not sex, though that's part of it, but genuine intimacy. The experience of being truly seen by another person. Of being able to express your authentic thoughts and feelings without fear of judgment or rejection. Of having conversations that go beneath the surface of logistics and small talk into real emotional territory. Of physical affection that's about connection rather than just obligation. That kind of intimacy, I didn't have it in my marriage. She held up her hand as if anticipating an objection. It wasn't Harlan's fault, not really. He was raised the same way I was, in a culture that didn't teach men to be emotionally available or communicate about feelings. He was taught to provide, protect, and maintain authority. I was taught to support, nurture, and maintain peace. Neither of us was taught to be vulnerable or seek genuine emotional connection. Those skills weren't part of the marriage education we received. So we had a marriage that looked perfect from the outside, Estelle continued, her voice growing quieter. We attended church together, sat at the dinner table as a family, took vacations to predictable destinations, celebrated holidays with appropriate enthusiasm. Harlan never forgot my birthday or our anniversary. I never forgot to have his favorite meals ready. We had sex with reasonable frequency, though it was perfunctory, a physical release for him, an obligation I fulfilled for me. We raised 3 children who were polite, educated, and successful. By every external measure, we had a good marriage. Estelle was quiet for a moment, watching a butterfly land on a nearby rosebush. But internally, emotionally, I was so lonely I sometimes felt like I couldn't breathe. I had a husband I slept beside every night who knew nothing about my inner life because I'd never learned to share it and he'd never learned to ask. I had children I loved desperately, but children need you to be their mother, not their confidant. I had friends and neighbors, but those relationships were governed by the same rules of pleasant superficiality that governed everything else. I remember one afternoon, Estelle said, her voice distant with memory, I was maybe 40 years old, standing at my kitchen sink washing dishes, looking out the window at our backyard where Harlan was mowing the lawn and the children were playing. And I thought, with sudden clarity, this is my life. This is all it will ever be. These routines, this surface-level existence, this carefully maintained performance of contentment. And I felt this wave of something, not quite despair, but a kind of resigned acceptance that this was what life was for women like me. You didn't get passionate love or deep connection or being truly known. You got stability, security, children, and the satisfaction of duty well performed. She turned to look at me, and I told myself that was enough, that wanting more was selfish, or unrealistic, or evidence of some flaw in my character. I told myself to be grateful for what I had, a good husband who didn't hurt me, healthy children, a comfortable home, financial security. Women in other times and places had it so much worse. Who was I to want more? Estelle's expression became almost fierce. That's what we did to women of my generation. We taught them to be grateful for not being actively harmed, rather than encouraging them to seek genuine happiness. We taught them that managing a household and raising children should be fulfilling enough, that wanting emotional intimacy or intellectual stimulation or physical passion was greedy. We taught them to suppress their needs so thoroughly that many of them forgot they had needs at all. I lived that way for 25 years, Estelle said quietly. From ages 20 to 45, I maintained that performance, pushed down that loneliness, told myself I was content. The children grew up and left home one by one. Judith went to college in 1978, Robert in 1980, Patricia in 1983. Suddenly, it was just Harlan and me in that house, and the silence was deafening. She paused, because when the children were home, they'd created noise and activity and constant demand for attention that filled the emotional emptiness. But with them gone, Harlan and I had to face the reality that we'd built a partnership based on child-rearing and household management, not on genuine connection. We'd sit at dinner together and have nothing to say. We'd spend evenings in the same room, him watching television, me reading or knitting, existing in parallel but not together. Some couples rediscover each other when the children leave, Estelle said. They find new shared interests, travel together, enjoy the freedom of being just a couple again. Harlan and I tried. We really did try. We took a trip to Florida. We joined a bowling league. We had date nights at the local restaurant. But we couldn't manufacture intimacy we'd never really had. You can't suddenly become vulnerable and emotionally open at 50 when you've spent 30 years being emotionally guarded. Estelle took a slow breath. And then in 1998, when I was 60 years old and Harlan was 65, he had a massive heart attack while working in the yard. He was dead before the ambulance arrived. 40 years of marriage ended in an instant on an ordinary Saturday afternoon in September. I sat in respectful silence, waiting for Estelle to continue when she was ready. Around us, the garden buzzed with insect activity and quiet human conversation, but we existed in our own bubble of shared story. The grief was complicated, Estelle said finally. I missed Harlan terribly. His presence, his routines, the shape of him in our shared life. But I also grieved what we'd never had, what I'd never even really allowed myself to acknowledge I wanted. I grieved the 40 years of surface-level connection when I'd been hungry for something deeper. I grieved the version of myself I'd suppressed to be a good wife. I grieved the loneliness that his death made visible but hadn't created. It had been there all along, just hidden under the daily routines of marriage. Estelle's expression grew distant. My children were wonderful during that time. They came home for the funeral, helped me manage the estate, and made sure I was eating and sleeping. But they had their own lives. Judith in Boston, Robert in Chicago, Patricia in Seattle. They couldn't stay, and I didn't want them to. I had to figure out who I was as Estelle Pritchard, not as Harlan's wife or Judith, Robert, and Patricia's mother. Just Estelle. She smiled slightly. And I discovered something surprising. I liked being alone. Not lonely alone. Lonely is unwanted isolation. Alone is chosen for solitude. And for the first time in my life, I had complete freedom to structure my days however I wanted, eat whatever I wanted, watch whatever I wanted, think whatever I wanted without considering anyone else's preferences or needs. I started slowly rebuilding my life, Estelle said. I joined a book club at the library. I started taking watercolor classes at the community center. I volunteered at a food bank. I made friends, real friends, not just pleasant acquaintances. Women who'd also been widowed or divorced, who were also learning to inhabit their own lives after decades of organizing existence around husbands and children. Her expression became more animated. And through these friendships, I started having conversations I'd never had before. Honest conversations about our marriages, our regrets, our longings, our relief at having freedom, our guilt about feeling relieved. We talked about things my generation never talked about: sex, desire, loneliness, the difference between loving someone and being genuinely intimate with them. Estelle looked at me intently. And that's when I started learning what intimacy actually means. Not the performance of marriage roles I'd maintained for 40 years, but genuine connection. Being able to say, "I'm struggling today," and having someone listen without trying to fix it. Being able to share a thought or observation and having someone engage with it rather than dismiss it. Being able to sit in comfortable silence with someone and feel connected rather than isolated. I thought that was all I needed, Estelle said. Friendship, independence, the freedom to structure my own life. I told myself I'd had my marriage, raised my children, and now this final third of life would be about peaceful solitude and female friendships. I wasn't looking for romance. I certainly wasn't looking for physical intimacy. I was 62 years old. That chapter was closed. She paused, and a smile played at the corners of her mouth. And then I met Sterling. Estelle's expression softened in a way I hadn't seen before, her eyes growing distant with a memory that was clearly precious to her. Sterling Kowalski, she said, pronouncing the name with careful tenderness. I met him at the library in 2002, when I was 64 and he was 67. I'd gone to the library to return books from our book club. We were reading Margaret Atwood, I remember, and I was standing at the circulation desk waiting to check out new books when this tall, silver-haired man approached the desk beside me. She smiled at the memory. He had an armful of books about woodworking and asked the librarian if they had any more detailed guides to furniture restoration. His voice was deep and warm, with a slight accent I couldn't quite place. And before I could stop myself, I said, "You might try the Technical College Library. They have a much more extensive collection of craft books." He turned to look at me with these extraordinarily kind brown eyes, and he said, "That's an excellent suggestion. Thank you. I'm Sterling, by the way." Estelle's voice took on a quality of wonder, as if she were still slightly amazed by what had unfolded from that simple introduction. We started talking right there in the library. About books, about woodworking, about how the library's collection had evolved over the years. The conversation was so easy, so natural. He made me laugh, actual laughter, not polite chuckles. And when the librarian announced they were closing in 15 minutes, Sterling asked if I'd like to continue our conversation over coffee. I said yes, Estelle continued. And that surprised me because I'd never done anything like that before. In my generation, in my social circle, you didn't just go get coffee with strange men. But Sterling didn't feel strange. He felt comfortable and safe and interesting. So we went to the coffee shop across the street, and we talked for 2 more hours. Estelle shifted on the bench, her expression becoming more thoughtful. I learned that Sterling had been widowed 5 years earlier, that his wife had died of breast cancer after a long illness, that he'd been a high school shop teacher for 35 years before retiring, that he'd moved to our town to be closer to his daughter and grandchildren after his wife died, that he was learning furniture restoration as a way to stay busy and useful in retirement. But more than the biographical details, Estelle said, I noticed how he talked. He asked questions and actually listened to the answers. He was comfortable with silence. We'd pause in conversation and it didn't feel awkward, just companionable. He talked about his late wife with love but without being trapped in the past. He was present, engaged, genuinely interested in getting to know me as a person, not as a potential replacement for what he'd lost. Her voice grew softer. At the end of that coffee, Sterling asked if I'd like to have dinner with him sometime. And I said yes again. And that's how, at 64 years old, I went on my first real date. Not the chaperoned courtship of my youth with Harlan, but an actual date. 2 adults chose to spend time together because they enjoyed each other's company. Estelle's expression became almost mischievous. My children were horrified when I told them I was dating. Not because of anything specific about Sterling, they hadn't even met him yet, but because the very concept of their 64-year-old mother dating seemed inappropriate to them. Judith said, "Mom, don't you think it's too soon after Dad?" Even though it had been 4 years. Robert said, "Mom, you don't need to date. You have us and the grandkids." Patricia was the only one who managed to be supportive, though even she seemed uncomfortable with the whole idea. "And I understood their discomfort," Estelle said. "Children don't want to think of their parents as sexual or romantic beings, especially as those parents age. It challenges the fundamental narrative they've built about who their parents are. But I also realized I couldn't let their comfort dictate my choices. This was my life, and I was finally doing something purely because I wanted to, not because it was expected or appropriate." Estelle's voice grew more animated. "Sterling and I dated for 6 months before anything physical happened beyond holding hands. 6 months of dinners and movies and long walks and endless conversations. 6 months of learning about each other, of building genuine friendship alongside romantic interest. And when we finally did kiss, in his car after dinner one evening, like teenagers, I felt something I'd never felt with Harlan. Not just physical attraction, though that was there, but genuine desire built on actual knowing. Being kissed by someone who actually saw me, who I'd been vulnerable with, who I'd had real conversations with, it was transformative." She looked at me directly. "And I know what you're probably thinking. That I'm romanticizing it, that new relationship energy always feels intense, that I was just experiencing the thrill of something different after 40 years of marriage. But it was more than that. It was discovering that intimacy, real intimacy, transforms everything, including physical connection." Estelle took a slow breath. "Sterling and I became lovers when I was 65 years old. And I'm using that word intentionally, not as a euphemism but as an accurate description. We made love, not just had sex. The difference is profound, though many people never experience it. Sex can be mechanical, perfunctory, or physical release. Making love is about connection, presence, vulnerability, genuine desire to give pleasure and receive it from this specific person. I learned things about myself in my 60s that I'd never known in my 20s, 30s, 40s, or 50s, Estelle continued, her voice growing stronger. I learned that my body, even at 65 with all its age-related changes, was still capable of pleasure. I learned that desire doesn't disappear with age. It evolves, becomes less urgent perhaps but deeper, more connected to emotional intimacy. I learned that being comfortable enough with someone to communicate about what you want and need creates possibilities that guessing and silence never can." Estelle's expression became more serious. "But more than the physical intimacy, I learned what emotional intimacy actually means. Sterling and I talked about everything. Our marriages, our regrets, our fears about aging and death and losing our independence. Our hopes for our children. Our grief over the friends and family members we'd lost. Our joy in small pleasures, good coffee, beautiful sunsets, finding a book we both loved. We were vulnerable with each other," she said, "in ways I'd never been vulnerable with Harlan. Sterling knew about my loneliness in my marriage, about the parts of myself I'd suppressed, about my complicated grief when Harlan died. I knew about his guilt over feeling relieved when his wife's suffering finally ended, about his fear of becoming dependent as he aged, about his worry that his adult children saw him as a burden to be managed." Estelle smiled softly. "That vulnerability, that willingness to be seen completely, flaws and fears and all, that's intimacy. And I discovered it's actually easier in your 60s and 70s than in your 20s and 30s, because you've stopped trying to maintain the pretense of perfection. You've lived long enough to know everyone is flawed, everyone is struggling with something, everyone is just doing their best. That knowledge creates space for genuine connection." "Sterling and I were together for 8 years, Estelle said, her voice becoming quieter. "We didn't live together, we both valued our independence too much for that, but we spent several evenings a week together. We traveled. Nothing exotic, just weekend trips to places within driving distance. We had routines and inside jokes and the comfortable intimacy that develops when you truly know someone." She paused, and I could see emotion crossing her face. He died in 2010, at 75. A stroke, sudden and catastrophic. I was with him in the hospital when he died, holding his hand. And as devastated as I was, as much as I grieved losing him, I felt grateful. Grateful that I'd had those 8 years. Grateful that I'd experienced real intimacy before I died. Grateful that I'd learned what connection actually meant. Estelle was quiet for a long moment. After Sterling died, I thought that was it. I'd had my second chance at love, experienced what I'd missed in my first marriage, learned what I needed to learn. I was 72 years old. Surely that was enough. She looked at me with an expression that mixed amusement and defiance. But here's what I've learned in the 14 years since Sterling died. The need for connection, for intimacy, for being seen and known, it doesn't expire. Society wants to believe that at some age, people become content with isolation, happy with just memories and occasional phone calls from family. But that's not how humans work. We're social creatures from birth to death. The need for touch, for companionship, for meaningful conversation, for someone who sees you as a whole person rather than just an old person, that need persists. I'm not currently in a romantic relationship, Estelle said. But I maintain deep friendships that include emotional intimacy. I have a friend, Deirdre, who I talk to several times a week. We share everything. Our fears about aging, our frustrations with our adult children, our grief over losses, our joy in small pleasures. That's an intimate connection, even without romance or physicality. I also have a gentleman friend, Wallace, who I spend time with occasionally, Estelle continued. We go to concerts, have dinner, and enjoy each other's company. We're affectionate. We hold hands, we hug, we provide physical comfort to each other. Is it romantic? Not really. Sexual? But it's intimate, in the sense that we're genuinely present for each other, genuinely see each other, genuinely provide connection. Estelle's voice became more passionate. This is what people don't understand about intimacy after 60, after 70, after 80. It's not about desperate attempts to recapture youth or deny aging. It's about recognizing that the fundamental human need for connection doesn't disappear just because your body ages. You still need to be touched with affection. You still need conversations that go deeper than the weather and your latest doctor's appointment. You still need to feel desired, not in a superficial physical way necessarily, but desired as in, someone actively wants your company, values your presence, chooses to spend time with you. She looked at me intently. And the tragedy is that so many elderly people are starving for this connection, but they're too ashamed to seek it because society has told them they're not supposed to need it anymore. Widows and widowers who are profoundly lonely but won't date because their children disapprove. Elderly people who never remarry because they don't want to be seen as disrespecting their late spouse's memory. People in nursing homes who aren't allowed physical privacy with partners because staff find elderly sexuality inappropriate or uncomfortable. The shame around elderly intimacy causes real harm, Estelle said firmly. It leads to depression, isolation, premature cognitive decline, and early death. Human beings literally need touch and connection to thrive at every age. Study after study shows this. But we've created a culture that treats elderly people as if they're no longer fully human, no longer entitled to the full range of human experience and need. Estelle settled back against the bench, her expression softening slightly. So yes, at 86, I still need intimacy. Not the same way I needed it at 26 or 46 or 66, but I still need it. I need friends who know me deeply. I need physical affection, hugs, hand-holding, the comfort of human touch. I need conversations that matter. I need to be seen as Estelle, a complete person with thoughts and feelings and experiences and desires, not just as the old lady or someone's grandmother. And I'm no longer ashamed of needing those things, she said with quiet conviction. I spent too many years being ashamed of needs I was told were inappropriate or selfish. I'm not spending my remaining years doing the same thing. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes after Estelle finished speaking. I was processing everything she'd shared, the loneliness of her first marriage, the discovery of genuine intimacy with Sterling, Her clear-eyed analysis of how society fails elderly people by denying their ongoing humanity. "Can I ask you something?" I said finally. "Of course. You mentioned that your children were uncomfortable with you dating after your husband died. How did you navigate that? The tension between living your own life and maintaining relationships with your children." Estelle's expression showed she'd given this considerable thought. "That's an excellent question, and the answer is, imperfectly, with some damage to those relationships that I regret but don't apologize for." She shifted on the bench. "Judith, my oldest, remained uncomfortable with my relationship with Sterling for the entire 8 years. She was polite to him when necessary, but she never warmed to him. She made comments about how quickly I'd replaced her father, even though it had been 4 years. She worried what people at church would think. She particularly struggled with the idea that Sterling and I were physically intimate, that was just beyond her capacity to accept. And I had to make a choice," Estelle said. "I could prioritize Judith's comfort and end my relationship with Sterling, living the rest of my life the way my daughter thought I should. Or I could prioritize my own well-being and happiness, accepting that Judith might never understand or approve. I chose the latter, and that created distance between us that persists to this day. We talk, we're cordial, but we're not close the way mothers and daughters sometimes are." She looked at me directly. "Do I regret that? Yes and no. I regret that Judith couldn't find it in herself to be happy for me, to understand that I was finally experiencing genuine intimacy and joy. But I don't regret choosing my own happiness over her approval. Because here's what I learned too late in life. You cannot live your life for your children's comfort. They have to build their own lives. You have to live yours. And if you sacrifice your well-being for their approval, you build resentment that poisons everything anyway." "Robert was more accepting, though still uncomfortable," Estelle continued. "He met Sterling, had dinner with us a few times, and made an effort to be welcoming. He told me privately that he wanted me to be happy, even if it felt strange to see me with someone who wasn't his father. That was as much as I could hope for, and I appreciated his effort. Patricia, my youngest, was genuinely supportive from the beginning," Estelle said warmly. "She told me she was glad I'd found companionship, glad I was happy, glad I wasn't spending my later years alone. She made Sterling feel welcome in our family. When he died, she came and stayed with me for a week, just sitting with me through the grief. That support meant everything." Estelle paused thoughtfully. "But I also had to confront the reality that my children's discomfort wasn't really about Sterling specifically. It was about the fact that I was a sexual, romantic being, not just their mother. Children want to freeze their parents in the role of parent, nurturing, self-sacrificing, focused entirely on family. When parents reveal themselves to be complete human beings with needs beyond caregiving, it's deeply unsettling for children. And I came to understand that their discomfort was their problem to manage, not mine to fix," Estelle said firmly. "I spent 40 years managing Harlan's comfort, prioritizing everyone else's needs. I wasn't going to spend my remaining years doing the same thing. If my children were uncomfortable with my sexuality or my romantic life, they could work through that discomfort with a therapist. It wasn't my responsibility to make myself smaller to ease their adjustment." I found myself admiring Estelle's clarity and firmness, her refusal to apologize for claiming space in her own life. "What about the broader community?" I asked. "You mentioned worrying about what people at church would think. Did you face judgment from your social circle?" Estelle's laugh was slightly bitter. "Oh yes. Some friends were supportive, but others were horrified. I lost several friendships over Sterling. Women I'd known for years suddenly became distant when I started dating. There were comments, never direct, but pointed enough to ensure I heard them, about propriety, about respecting Harlan's memory, about setting an appropriate example. One woman, Barbara, who I'd been friends with for 30 years, actually said to me, 'Don't you think you're too old to be carrying on like a teenager?' Estelle's voice held remembered indignation. As if enjoying companionship and physical intimacy at 65 was somehow inappropriate. As if I was supposed to put on a black dress and spend my remaining decades mourning. She shook her head. But I also found new friends, women who'd also discovered late-life intimacy, who understood what I was experiencing. Women who'd remarried after widowhood, or who were dating, or who were simply honest about still having needs and desires. We formed our own small community, supporting each other against the judgment of people who thought we should be content with memories and grandchildren. The judgment extended beyond just social disapproval, Estelle continued, her voice becoming more serious. There were practical complications too. When Sterling and I wanted to travel together, we had to book separate hotel rooms because we weren't married, and the idea of an unmarried elderly couple sharing a room scandalized hotel staff. When I visited Sterling in the hospital during his final illness, I wasn't given the same consideration as family because I wasn't his wife. I couldn't make medical decisions, couldn't access certain information, had no legal standing despite being his primary companion for 8 years. Those structural barriers exist because society refuses to acknowledge that elderly people have romantic and sexual relationships outside of marriage, Estelle explained. Everything is set up to accommodate traditional family structures, spouse, children, with no recognition that many elderly people build intimate partnerships that don't fit those neat categories. She paused, then continued with renewed intensity. But perhaps the most insidious judgment came from healthcare providers. Doctors who dismissed my questions about sexual health because they assumed I was no longer sexually active. Nurses who made jokes about elderly sexuality being inappropriate or gross. Mental health providers who interpreted my desire for intimacy as depression or inability to accept widowhood, rather than as a normal human need. I remember one particularly awful experience, Estelle said, anger creeping into her voice. About a year after Harlan died, I mentioned to my doctor that I was experiencing some discomfort during sex. The doctor, a woman younger than my daughters, looked at me with barely concealed disgust and said, "At your age, Mrs. Pritchard, perhaps it's time to accept that some activities are no longer appropriate." She wouldn't prescribe treatment, wouldn't refer me to a specialist, just dismissed my concern because she couldn't handle the idea of a 61-year-old woman being sexually active. I changed doctors, Estelle added. Found one who treated me like a complete person, who didn't flinch when I discussed my relationship with Sterling, who understood that sexual health matters at every age. But the fact that I had to search for a healthcare provider willing to treat me with basic dignity speaks to how deeply ageist assumptions about sexuality are embedded in our medical system. I sat absorbing all of this, realizing how much I'd never considered the challenges elderly people face in maintaining intimate relationships. "What would you want people to understand?" I asked. "If you could communicate one essential truth about intimacy and aging, what would it be?" Estelle was quiet for a moment, clearly considering her answer carefully. "I think the essential truth is this: intimacy doesn't end with age, it evolves. And that evolution, if you allow yourself to experience it without shame, can be beautiful." She leaned forward slightly, her expression intense. Young intimacy is often about urgency, about physical passion, about the excitement of discovering someone new. Middle-age intimacy is often about partnership, about shared responsibilities and building a life together. But late-life intimacy, that's about presence, about being fully there with someone, knowing that time is limited, that every moment matters. About communicating clearly because you no longer have decades to figure each other out through trial and error. About appreciating what you have rather than focusing on what you've lost. With Sterling, Estelle continued, her voice softening, everything was slower, more intentional. We didn't have the physical stamina of young people, but we had patience, attention, the willingness to communicate about what we needed and wanted. We had the confidence that comes from experience, the comfort with our bodies that takes decades to develop. We had the understanding that physical intimacy is just one part of connection, not the entirety of it. Her expression became more reflective. And we had the perspective that comes from having loved and lost. Sterling had watched his wife die slowly. I'd experienced the loneliness of being physically together but emotionally isolated. We both understood how precious genuine connection is, how rare, how easily lost. That understanding made us treat each moment as valuable, made us not take each other for granted the way younger people often do. So when people ask me what intimacy is like after 60, Estelle said, I tell them it's different but not less. It's softer but deeper. It's less about performance and more about presence. It's less about meeting expectations and more about genuine mutual pleasure. It's less about what your body can do and more about what your heart can feel. She settled back against the bench, her expression peaceful. And I tell them that discovering this, learning what real intimacy actually means, was worth every moment of discomfort, every bit of judgment, every strained relationship with my children. Because I spent 40 years in a marriage where I was never truly seen, never truly known, never truly connected. And then I spent 8 years experiencing what I'd been missing. And those 8 years taught me more about love and connection and what it means to be human than the previous 60 years combined. Estelle looked at me directly. I'm 86 years old. I may not live to see 90. But I will die knowing that I experienced genuine intimacy, that I was truly seen by another person, that I had the courage to claim my own needs and desires despite the judgment. And that feels like a life well lived, even if it didn't follow the script I was given. We sat together for a while longer, the afternoon beginning to shift toward evening, the light taking on that golden quality that makes everything seem more significant. I found myself thinking about everything Estelle had shared, not just the specifics of her story, but the broader implications about how we think about aging, intimacy, and the fullness of human experience at every life stage. Can I ask one more question? I said finally. Please. You've talked about your own journey, your own discoveries about intimacy. But you mentioned earlier that there are many elderly people starving for connection but too ashamed to seek it. What would you say to them if you could? Estelle's expression became both tender and fierce. I would say, your needs are valid. Your desires are normal. Your loneliness is not a personal failing. It's a natural response to isolation that you don't have to accept as inevitable. You are entitled to seek connection, to pursue relationships, to claim pleasure and intimacy and joy, regardless of your age. She continued with growing passion. I would say, ignore the people who tell you that wanting companionship is disrespecting your late spouse's memory. Your spouse, if they truly loved you, would want you to be happy, not to spend decades alone out of some misplaced sense of loyalty to the dead. Honoring someone's memory doesn't mean refusing to live fully after they're gone. I would say, don't let your adult children's discomfort dictate your choices, Estelle added. They love you, presumably, but they're not entitled to control your romantic or sexual life any more than you were entitled to control theirs when they were adults. Set boundaries. Live your life. Let them manage their own discomfort. Her voice became gentler. And I would say, be patient with yourself. If you spent decades in a marriage where intimacy meant something limited or unsatisfying, it will take time to learn new patterns, to be vulnerable in new ways, to trust that genuine connection is possible. Don't expect it to happen instantly. Allow yourself to be clumsy, uncertain, awkward. That's all part of learning. Most importantly, Estelle said, her voice strong and clear, I would say, you are still a whole person. Still entitled to touch, affection, desire, pleasure. Still capable of giving and receiving love. Still worthy of being seen, known, valued. Age hasn't erased your humanity, it's just changed some of the external details. Don't internalize society's ageist beliefs that you're no longer entitled to the full range of human experience. She paused, then added quietly, and I would tell them about resources they might not know exist. Support groups for widowed people that explicitly discuss dating and sexuality. Therapists who specialize in late-life relationship issues. Books and websites created by and for elderly people navigating intimacy. Communities of people experiencing the same challenges, the same desires, the same judgment. Because connection isn't just about romantic partnership, it's also about finding people who understand your experience and can say, me too. You're not alone in this. Estelle smiled slightly. Actually, that's part of what I do now. I volunteer with an organization that helps widowed seniors rebuild their social lives after loss. We host events, facilitate discussions, connect people with resources and with each other. It's deeply rewarding work, seeing people emerge from isolation into connection again. This was the first time Estelle had mentioned this volunteer work, and I felt a sudden recognition that her story wasn't just a personal narrative, it was also a mission, a commitment to helping others avoid the isolation she'd experienced. "How long have you been doing that work?" I asked. "About 12 years now," Estelle replied. "Started shortly after Sterling died, partly as a way to process my own grief, partly because I saw such tremendous need. So many elderly people, especially women, who'd lost spouses and had no idea how to build new lives. Who felt guilty for wanting companionship. Who were profoundly lonely but too ashamed to admit it. I wanted to create spaces where those feelings could be acknowledged and addressed." She continued, "We organize social events, game nights, book clubs, group outings to museums or concerts. But we also facilitate more intimate discussion groups where people can talk honestly about their needs, their fears, their desires. Where a 75-year-old widow can say, 'I miss being held,' and have people respond with understanding rather than judgment. Where an 80-year-old widower can admit he's considering dating and receive support rather than criticism. The work has taught me so much," Estelle said thoughtfully. "I've met people whose stories make mine seem simple. People who are navigating late-life sexuality after decades in sexless marriages. People coming out as gay or lesbian in their 70s, finally claiming identities they suppressed their entire lives. People with physical disabilities or health issues trying to figure out how intimacy works within those constraints. People in nursing homes fighting for the right to privacy with partners despite staff resistance." Her expression became more serious. "And I've learned that the shame and stigma around elderly sexuality causes real, measurable harm. I've met people who are so isolated, so convinced they're not entitled to connection anymore, that they've essentially given up on life. Depression, cognitive decline, physical deterioration, all accelerated by loneliness and lack of touch. We're social creatures. We need connection to survive. Denying elderly people access to intimacy is denying them access to basic human needs." Estelle looked at me directly. "That's why I'm willing to talk about this so openly, even knowing it might make people uncomfortable. Because the silence, the collective agreement not to discuss elderly sexuality and intimacy, that silence is killing people. Literally killing them through isolation and shame and the internalization of ageist beliefs that they no longer matter, no longer deserve joy, no longer have anything to offer or receive. Someone needs to say, 'This is normal, this is healthy, this is your right,'" she continued firmly. "And if saying that makes me seem inappropriate or undignified to some people, I'm comfortable with that trade-off. Because I'd rather be seen as inappropriate than watch more people suffer needlessly." I sat with that for a moment, impressed by Estelle's clarity of purpose and willingness to endure judgment in service of helping others. "Thank you," I said finally, "for your honesty, for your willingness to share such personal experiences, for the work you do to help others. This conversation has been," I paused, searching for adequate words, "genuinely illuminating." Estelle smiled warmly. "Thank you for listening without judgment. You'd be surprised how rare that is. Most people, when I start discussing these topics, either shut down the conversation or make jokes to ease their discomfort. You just listened and asked thoughtful questions. That's a gift." She glanced at her watch, an elegant silver piece that looked like it had been worn for decades. "I should probably head home soon. I have dinner plans with Deirdre and Wallace. We're trying a new restaurant that just opened downtown." As we both stood from the bench, gathering our belongings, I found myself not wanting the conversation to end, sensing that Estelle had more wisdom to share than we'd been able to cover in one afternoon. "Would you be willing to talk again sometime?" I asked. "I'd love to hear more about your volunteer work, about the people you've helped. This feels like an important story that needs to be told more widely." Estelle's expression showed pleasure at the request. "I'd be happy to. I come to this garden most Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, weather permitting. I'm always happy to have company and conversation." We exchanged contact information, and as we prepared to part ways, Estelle touched my arm gently. "David, thank you for caring about this. For seeing elderly people as whole humans worthy of full lives. That awareness, that willingness to listen and learn, it matters more than you might realize." With that, Estelle walked slowly toward the garden's exit, her posture still straight despite her 86 years, her movements careful but confident. I watched her go, my mind full of everything she'd shared, already beginning to process how her story might be told, what lessons it held not just about aging but about intimacy at any age, about the importance of claiming your own needs despite others' judgment. Over the following weeks, I did meet with Estelle again, multiple times. We'd sit on that same bench in the community garden, and she'd share more stories about the people she'd helped through her volunteer work, about the various challenges elderly people face in pursuing intimacy, about the small victories and ongoing struggles. She told me about Margaret, a 78-year-old woman who'd been married for 56 years to a man who'd never once asked what she wanted or needed sexually, and who discovered at 78, through a new relationship, that her body was capable of pleasure she'd never imagined. About Harold, an 82-year-old widower who'd come out as gay after his wife's death, finally claiming an identity he'd suppressed for 8 decades. About Rosemary and James, both in their late 70s, who'd met at one of Estelle's social events and developed a companionship that included physical intimacy despite the challenges of arthritis, diabetes, and various other health issues. Every story reinforced Estelle's central message: intimacy doesn't end with age. It evolves, changes form, requires adjustment and communication and creativity. But the fundamental human need for connection, for touch, for being seen and known, that persists from birth to death. I also learned more about Estelle's current life, about the rich network of relationships she'd built, about Deirdre, her closest friend, with whom she shared an emotional intimacy that many marriages lack, about Wallace, her gentleman friend, who provided companionship and affection without the complications of formal partnership, about her book club and her watercolor class and her volunteer work, all the ways she'd structured a life that was full and meaningful and connected. And I learned that Estelle was right about the judgment she faced. When I mentioned to my own parents that I'd been having conversations with an elderly woman about intimacy and aging, they were visibly uncomfortable. When I told friends I was considering writing about elderly sexuality, several made jokes or changed the subject. The discomfort was universal, confirming Estelle's observation that we collectively prefer to pretend elderly people are asexual, that their needs somehow evaporate at some arbitrary age. About 2 months after our initial meeting, I was sitting with Estelle in the garden when she said something that would become the cornerstone of how I understood her story. "You know what I've learned, David? The thing that took me 60 years to understand." "What's that?" "Intimacy isn't about being desired for your youth or beauty or physical perfection," she said thoughtfully. "That's an attraction, which is different. Real intimacy is about being desired for your complete self, your thoughts, your history, your flaws, your fears, your joys. It's about someone choosing your company not because you meet some standard of desirability, but because they genuinely want to know you and be known by you." She continued, "And that kind of intimacy, the deep, genuine kind, it's actually easier to find in your later years than your early ones. Because you've stopped performing. You've stopped trying to be whoever you think you should be and started being whoever you actually are. And when you're authentic, you attract people who value authenticity. You build connections based on truth rather than pretense." Estelle smiled. "That's why late-life intimacy can be so profound. You're not trying to impress anyone. You're not worried about whether your body is perfect or your sexual performance is adequate or whether you're meeting expectations. You're just present with another person, sharing what you have, receiving what they offer, building connections through honesty rather than through image management." "With Sterling," she said, her voice tender with memory, "I was more myself than I'd ever been with Harlan. I told Sterling about my loneliness in my marriage, my regrets, my frustrations, my desires. Things I'd never told anyone because I'd been taught those feelings were inappropriate. And Sterling didn't judge me. He just saw me, accepted me, valued me. That's intimacy. That's what I'd been missing for 60 years. I found myself thinking about my own relationships, about how much energy I spent on image management, on trying to appear more confident or successful or together than I actually felt. And I wondered if Estelle was right, if genuine intimacy required dropping those pretenses, which became easier with age simply because you ran out of energy for maintaining facades. That's the gift of aging that nobody tells you about, Estelle said, as if reading my thoughts. You become too tired to pretend, and that exhaustion is actually liberation. You stop performing and start living. And the people who remain in your life when you stop performing, those are your people. The ones worth keeping. It's been 6 months now since I first met Estelle in that community garden. We still meet regularly, still have long conversations about intimacy and aging and human connection. She's become a friend, not just a source for stories, and I've learned as much from observing her life as from listening to her narratives. I watch how she interacts with Wallace, the comfortable affection between them, the hand-holding and gentle touches, the way they look at each other with genuine fondness. I watch her with Deirdre, the deep emotional intimacy of their friendship, the way they can communicate entire thoughts with a glance, the safety they've created for complete vulnerability. I watch her at the volunteer events she's invited me to observe, the skill with which she creates space for people to acknowledge needs they've been taught to hide, the gentle way she challenges ageist assumptions while respecting people's discomfort. And I see that Estelle practices what she teaches. She's built a life rich in connection, not the single, all-consuming partnership that marriage is supposed to be, but a network of meaningful relationships that meet different needs. She's created intimacy on her own terms, refusing to accept society's narrow definition of what relationships should look like for someone her age. Last week, Estelle told me something that clarified even further her philosophy about intimacy and aging. You know what the real tragedy is, David? Not that elderly people can't find intimacy, but that so many of them don't even try because they've internalized the message that they shouldn't want it. They've accepted that loneliness is just the price of aging, that isolation is inevitable, that their remaining years should be spent quietly declining rather than actively living. She continued, but loneliness isn't inevitable. It's a choice, not always a conscious choice, but a choice nonetheless. You can choose isolation because it feels safer than risking rejection or judgment. Or you can choose a connection despite the risks. Neither choice is wrong, but people should at least know they have the choice. That they're entitled to pursue connection if they want it. And here's what I wish more people understood, Estelle said with intensity. Every year you spend isolated because you're too ashamed to seek connection is a year you can't get back. Every opportunity for joy you turn down because you think you're too old for it is gone forever. Every time you suppress a need because you've been taught it's inappropriate, that's time stolen from the life you could be living. Her voice became softer. I wasted 60 years in various forms of isolation. 40 years in a marriage where I was never truly seen. 4 years of widowhood before I allowed myself to seek connection again. 8 precious years with Sterling. Then 12 more years of consciously building the connected life I have now. And I'm grateful for what I learned and experienced, but I also grieve what I missed. 60 years is a long time to wait before discovering what intimacy actually means. Estelle looked at me directly. I don't want other people to waste that much time. I don't want 70-year-olds to think it's too late for them to find a connection. I don't want 80-year-olds to believe they're no longer entitled to touch and affection. I don't want 90-year-olds to spend their final years alone because they've accepted ageist beliefs about what's appropriate. That's why I'm so open about my own experiences, she said. Why I volunteer, why I talk about these topics without shame, why I'm willing to endure judgment. Because if my honesty gives even one person permission to seek the connection they need, it's worth it. If my story helps someone understand that late-life intimacy is possible and valid and beautiful, then sharing it serves a purpose beyond just telling my tale. I sat with that, understanding that Estelle's willingness to share such personal details wasn't just generosity, it was activism. A deliberate choice to challenge ageist assumptions by living visibly, speaking openly, refusing to be silenced by discomfort. What do you hope happens? I asked. If you could change one thing about how society treats elderly people and intimacy, what would it be? Estelle considered this carefully. I'd want us to extend to elderly people the same basic assumption we extend to younger people, that they're entitled to pursue happiness, connection, intimacy, joy. That their needs are valid. That their choices about their own bodies and relationships are theirs to make. That seems like it should be obvious, but it's not. We infantilize elderly people, treating them as if they need protection from their own desires, as if they're no longer capable of making informed decisions about intimate relationships. She continued, I'd want healthcare providers to ask elderly patients about their sexual health and relationship satisfaction without embarrassment or judgment. I'd want nursing homes to provide privacy for residents to pursue intimacy without surveillance or interference. I'd want families to support elderly parents who choose to date or remarry rather than making them feel guilty or inappropriate. I'd want cultural narratives that include elderly people as romantic and sexual beings, not just as grandparents or wise mentors or people waiting to die. Most fundamentally, Estelle said, I'd want us to recognize that elderly people are whole humans with the full range of human needs and desires. Not diminished versions of their younger selves, but complete people in a different life stage. And that completeness includes the capacity and right to give and receive love, to seek pleasure, to build intimate connections, to be seen and known and valued. She smiled slightly. But until that cultural shift happens, and it will take generations, individuals can still make choices that honor their own needs. They can seek connection despite judgment. They can build relationships that work for them rather than conforming to narrow expectations. They can refuse to be ashamed of being fully human, fully alive, regardless of their age. Estelle stood from the bench, gathering her things. And people like me can keep telling our stories, keep challenging assumptions, keep insisting that intimacy doesn't expire at any arbitrary age. Keep being visible examples of elderly people living fully, joyfully, connected lives. That's the work. Slow work, uncomfortable work, but important work. As I watched Estelle walk away that day, I realized she was right about the importance of visibility. Her willingness to share her story, to talk openly about topics most people prefer to avoid, to live publicly as a sexual and romantic being in her 80s, it challenged my own assumptions in ways I was still processing. And I understood that this was the story I needed to tell. Not just Estelle's personal narrative, but the broader truth she represented, that intimacy, connection, and love don't end at 60 or 70 or 80 or 90. They evolve, yes. They require adjustment and communication and creativity. But the fundamental human need to be seen, known, touched, valued, that persists across every stage of life. Estelle's story wasn't just about one woman's journey through marriage, widowhood, and rediscovery. It was about all of us, about how we age, what we lose, what we can still find if we're brave enough to look. About the difference between performing life and living it. About choosing connection over comfort, vulnerability over protection, joy over propriety. The question Estelle's story poses isn't whether elderly people should pursue intimacy, it's why we ever thought they shouldn't. Why we collectively decided that human needs expire at arbitrary ages. Why do we create cultural narratives that deny the full humanity of people simply because they've lived long enough to accumulate wrinkles and gray hair? And the answer, I've come to believe, is that acknowledging elderly sexuality and intimacy forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. That our own parents and grandparents are sexual beings. That we ourselves will age and will still have needs when we do. That aging doesn't mean transcending physicality but rather adjusting how we inhabit our bodies. That there are no stages of life where we become pure spirit, free from desire and need and the complicated messiness of being embodied humans. Estelle understood this. She'd lived through decades of denying her own needs before finally claiming them. And she decided that the remaining years of her life would be spent not just living fully herself, but helping others do the same. That's intimacy in its truest form, not just connection with a romantic partner, but connection with community, with purpose, with the fullness of your own humanity regardless of age or expectation. What did this story mean to you? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like, and subscribe to the 11th Hour Tales for more eye-opening tales every day.